We're beginning with Act 1, Scene 3 of Inside the Island by Nowra. We've just read Act 1, Scene 2, where we've seen a bit of a comedy of manners genre. We're continuing with the next scene, the living room the next day. Susan Dawson is standing in the middle of the room wearing a half-completed dress. Sunlight shines and bands through the unseen slats of Venetian blinds. George enters. Notice the setting, notice the light coming in. Where's your mother? Getting some pins. Have you seen my bike? No. Pause there. Do you want me to close the blinds? Too gloomy. Mum making you a new dress, is she? For the picnic. What picnic? With the soldiers. Why? Notice how George keeps asking questions and Susan replies in monosyllables. Obviously, there's something wrong with that father-daughter relationship. The father is making an effort, but the daughter is not. So on the one hand, it's very typical of the relationship a teenage girl will have with her father. Yet, it tells us something more about the dysfunctional nature of this family. Let's read on. Lillian enters. Because I thought it would be good manners. How many soldiers are there? 50. What? 50 soldiers here? So George, for someone who claims to be a man who knows everything, or doesn't claim to know everything, but is a man who claims to own the land, he certainly doesn't know what's happening on that land. He doesn't know that there are soldiers encamped there, 50 soldiers, and he certainly didn't know that Peter Blackwood was living on his land. At the cricket ground, Captain Henry wanted to know if he could use the ground for a cricket match for his soldiers, and I said yes. I also suggested making it into a picnic. She places a wide-brimmed hat on Susan. There, that looks excellent. Notice the reference to the cricket ground. This will become important in the second act of the play. And the wide-brimmed hat is to protect Susan from the sun, so that's costume. Susan says it's too wide. Lillian says it will protect your complexion. You don't want to look like a factory girl, do you? Besides, a wide-brimmed hat. Oh, the pins. I forgot the pins. And she exits. In Victorian England, and in other times, the people who used to work out in the fields, the poor people, used to be a little bit darker because they were working out in the sun. The upper class was distinguishable by the fact that they were more pale, more white, because they didn't need to work outside and they would be inside their homes all day. So we can see a class distinction being drawn here again, Lillian drawing attention to class. We already know that we don't like Lillian, and therefore we are positioned to not like the values that Lillian represents as well. So when we are positioned to disapprove of a character or dislike a character, it means we are also being positioned to disapprove and dislike the values and the ideologies that that character represents. So if Lillian values class, we are positioned to criticize class as a value because we are positioned to criticize Lillian. George spots a beautiful evening dress on a chair. Your mother made this for you? It arrived this morning from Sydney. You can't use it for a picnic. It's far too good for that. It's not for picnics. It's an evening dress. Look at the interesting family dynamics here. It is a dysfunctional family, but what's going on? Try and think about that. Also, there doesn't seem to be any parental control that George has over his daughter. It seems to be that Lillian is the boss of the house, not just in control of George, but also of her daughter. George continues, you won't get much use for it here. I know, it's coming with me to England. Eh? With my other clothes. What's this about England? George doesn't even know his own daughter is going to England. Also remember that England was the colonial mother for Australia. On my trip. It's definite. Mum made the booking last week. She didn't tell me. You agreed. No, I didn't. You and your mum are always talking about such things. A new house, trips to England, living in Sydney. I want to see England, to travel. You can travel here. Here, this place. I want to see beautiful cities, learn refinement, and be educated in nice things. I want to see and do those things. I can't get them here. So what is it that's making Susan want to go abroad? What does this reveal about her attitude to Australia? And remember the cultural cringe. She wants to see beautiful cities, refinement, and be educated in nice things, suggesting that she cannot get them in Australia, that Australia does not have beautiful cities, it is not refined, and Australia does not allow her to be educated in nice things. We can see Susan's cultural cringe, and can we think about where this cultural cringe is coming from? It's not coming from her father, but it is coming from her mother. So Susan has inherited or learned and acquired her mother's cultural cringe. Remember how Lillian had in the previous scene talked about how England is so green, 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 unlike Australia. And remember also how she and her father have stripped away anything that is authentic to Australia and to Australian nature. George continues, "It's not my fault. Look, I know it must be hard for a girl as pretty as you to be here." Susan very quietly says, "It's not only being here. It's me." And Susan turns away from her father's gaze. "Mum told me what happened last night. I fell in the creek." And realizes that Susan is annoyed with his lie. "And I had a little bit too much." So again we have George as, right now, a typical Aussie guy who drinks. "Do you know why I never brought any of my school friends back here to stay in the holidays?" "You can't say that. It's true. It's true." "Don't say that. I try very hard. I'll try very hard, but please don't say things like that." He hugs her. She goes rigid. Notice the body language when she goes rigid. Notice the movement when he tries to hug her. This is a dysfunctional relationship. They don't have a relationship. "I love you. You're the most important thing in my life. I've never hurt you. Surely you must realize that." But what we can see is that this is a very one-sided love. So there's an interesting relationship between George and Susan. Think about how this relationship is constructed using not just dialogue, but other dramatic conventions as well. "When are you going?" And Susan yells nervously, "Mum, look at the right drawer." "You listen to your mother too much. When are you going?" "In a month." "Mum, look in the right drawer." "I don't want you to go. You're all I have. I know you think me weak. You must believe that I'll do anything for you." So George is not a strong man. He's rather weak, but he does want to make his daughter happy. "You can do Mum and me a favour." "I'll do you a favour. Don't come and see me off on the ship." George looks stunned. Susan is embarrassed of George, and we can see that she values social perception and what other people think more than she values her father. Where has she learnt this from? From her mother. "You'll be drunk as usual and embarrass everybody. A lot of my friends are coming to see me off." George is hurt. "I won't embarrass you." "You will. I can't trust you, Dad. You said you'd do me a favour." "Mum, the right drawer." So we can see that Susan has been spoiled by Lillian and that she is just like her mother. Lillian enters. "No need to shout. They were in the left drawer." "I thought you were going up to the mill." I was looking for my bike. It's on the front veranda." Lillian starts pinning Susan's dress. "You're sending her to England?" "She'll be staying with Aunt Annie." "I want to go." "Can't it wait?" "She's going. We've discussed this before. She's going to be a great lady. She can't spend the rest of her life in this backwater with riffraff. She has to learn and experience what the world has to offer. Hold still, Susan." So how does Lillian see Australia? As backwater. How does she see Australians? As riffraff. Her cultural cringe is coming through. Suddenly the captain of stage calls out, "Mrs. Dawson!" And then he suddenly arrives at the doorway. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Your cook said just to go down the corridor. And he sees George. Good morning, Mr. Dawson. So the captain has come into the house and turned up in this room. He seems to be very familiar with the layout of the house and very familiar with the occupants of the house. Is this another suggestion that perhaps he and Lillian are having an affair? Not sure. How do you interpret it? Also, again, a reference to the cook, which points out the social class. There are also some comments here that indicate that George is rather contemptuous of Lillian. Let's read on. George nods perfunctorily. The cook? I knocked on the front door and she answered it. She should never be allowed out of the kitchen. Never mind. What was it you wanted? Notice how Lillian talks about the cook and that everyone should be in a certain place. And notice how we never learn the cook's name. She is nameless. She's dehumanized for us. And so the cook is defined not by who she is as a person or an individual, but by what she does. Very Victorian era. And we learn about the differences in social class again and how Lillian likes those differences. So Lillian promotes and reinforces social distinction. And if Lillian does that, how do we respond to that? Captain says, I'm afraid our cook under-ordered before we left Sydney. New supplies should be coming next week, but we need some flour for the cricket match. Can we buy some from you? Just for the match, not much. Cook wants to make bread and cakes. He fancies himself as a bit of a pastry cook. Doesn't sound like much. It's a privilege to have you in the district. You can have the flour as a gift. Is that all right, George? So George says, sure. It's a little bit ironic that she's asking him because we know who makes the final decision and everything, and it's not George. Lillian says to the captain, send one of your men over to the mill and ask the foreman. His name is Arthur, to give you what you want from bin 5. Now, we're also wondering why Lillian is being so generous. Let's read on. That's very kind. Bin 5? You can't use the stuff from bin 5. Why not? There's something wrong with it. Nonsense. I saw it yesterday morning. She turns to Captain Henry. Sorry, Captain Henry. I must, in all due honesty, point out that the wheat isn't first class. So is that why she's giving this gift to the officers? Because it's not good enough for her to eat? Captain says, that's all right. It's only for the non-coms. They won't know the difference. The captain is just as snobby as Lillian, because the spoilt wheat is only for the non-coms or the non-commissioned servicemen who are the lower class people, not the officers. So we can see the class distinction there. And remember the thing about second-class wheat, the second-class servicemen, the second-class soldiers. This is how Britain saw Australia, as second class, as something beneath them. And it explains Lillian's cultural cringe. Exactly. Mr. Dawson will get the foreman to arrange for the bags to be picked up by your men. I'm very grateful, Mrs. Dawson, and to you, Mr. Dawson. Not many people would be as kind as you to give us such a gift. It's rather ironic, because Lillian is not being generous at all. Our pleasure, the least we can do. It's a gift like the land my father gave the government. Lillian is constantly bragging. I'm sorry for the intrusion. No apologies necessary, Captain. We were glad to be of help. True generosity would be giving good wheat, not bad. So Lillian's supposed act of generosity is not being actually generous. Captain goes on, good morning, Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Dawson, Miss Dawson, and thank you again, and he leaves. So Lillian says to George, why do you make such a fuss? Fuss? How could I compete with your theatrical gestures? You wouldn't know a magnanimous gesture if it bit you. There's something wrong with the flour in bin 5. It's all right, I saw it yesterday. I don't know, it's very grey. We won't be using it. Lillian doesn't care about the flour that she gives other people. And even though George gets drunk, he still has more moral fiber than Lillian because he realizes that that flour is bad and doesn't think it should be given to the soldiers. But he's too weak to pursue it with his wife. He tries getting angry. Look, I'm telling you there's something wrong with it. You wouldn't know. Soldiers have the appetites of horses. You could feed them chaff and they wouldn't know the difference. Fix it up with Arthur before lunch. Bin 5. 2 bags should be enough. No, better make it 4. So Lillian is bossy. She likes being in control. She's domineering. And basically she has the attitude that what's good for me is too good for you because I'm better than you. George gives in. He's too weak. He begins to go, "You'll be back for lunch?" And he angrily says, "No." He exits, and mother and daughter work on the dress. Don't slouch. I'm tired. Posture affects beauty. You're not that attractive yet. Beauty flows from within. It's very ironic that Lillian is giving this lecture to Susan because it doesn't really apply to her, though, does it? The beauty is from within. Or it does, because she's not very beautiful inside, is she? I shall be the only female at this picnic, won't I? I'm not female. I mean unattached. I'm sure the captain will tell his boys to be on their best behaviour. I guess I'll be extremely popular. A 72-year-old spinster with rickets would be popular at such a gathering if she were the only female. Well, that's a comfort. You need to be cut down a peg or two occasionally. Again, ironic, because who is the person who needs to be cut down a peg or two? It's actually Lillian. Don't forget, tomorrow evening you have Mrs. Harrison and her son. And Susan looks annoyed at hearing about this. I did my duty when I was your age. We must help those who are less fortunate than ourselves. It is our duty, our good works. This kind of duty, the kind where wealthy people, look after or do something to help lower class people, in this particular case is not generosity or compassion. But it is a kind of showing off that we are doing our duty and we are good, charitable people. There's a term for this, a French term. It's called noblesse oblige. Noblesse oblige, noblesse oblige. She sticks in another pin. Last night I heard you moaning. Me? Perhaps you were dreaming. I came and stood at your door. I don't remember. When you're in England, you'll learn more restraint. Cultivation will follow. Look at your father, no restraint. The good thing about Australians is that they have learned not to indulge in soul-searching. Your father, as usual, is the exception to this rule, hence his drinking. Sometimes I believe he's going around the bend. Look at Lillian's advice to Susan. What does this reveal about his character? About her character? And look at how she talks about her father, about George, and about Australians. There's no restraint. What was important in Victorian England? Restraint. Restraining your emotions, not letting yourself get carried away. Restraining your sexuality. So here is a criticism of her husband, of her daughter's father. And it's ironic because Lillian's criticism and comments and sarcasm are hardly restrained or cultured. So Susan asks, "Why did you marry him?" And Lillian smiles. Momentary insanity. In his own way he is kind, but he's so weak he can afford to be kind. Suggesting that people who are powerful should not be kind. Lillian steps back and looks at the dress. Not too bad. She goes to the small table and pours herself a glass of sherry from the decanter. Now, if you remember back to last scene, Lillian made a point of saying in front of the captain and the sergeant that she doesn't drink. And yet here she is drinking sherry, the same sherry from the decanter. And remember, that's a second-class British drink. So everything about her screams fake. Men, when you're in England, my dear, You'll think the men are different, better, more civilized. Be warned, only the techniques are different. She takes a sip of sherry and is disgusted by the taste. She holds the glass up to the light. Strange. Blackout. Why is she disgusted by the taste? And why is she saying strange? Remember how the sergeant had mixed sherry into the lemonade into the sherry? That's why. It also tells us that Lillian is very used to drinking sherry because she knows what the taste is. We've also learned how very hypocritical Lillian is in this scene. All right, let's go to scene 4. It's evening. We're out in the veranda. The veranda does become an important setting, but we will talk about that later. Cicadas. Susan is sitting in a cane chair. Mrs. Harrison and her son Andy are sitting on a bench facing her. Susan, bored, listens to Mrs. Harrison laboriously reading from a children's book. Mrs. Harrison is barely literate. Her son Andy is a half-wit. Already, we can see, just through the dramatic conventions here, that Susan is not interested in this task. And as we read through this scene, look at the different ways that becomes more evident. We can see that she is bored. Perhaps we can refer to her facial expression there, or perhaps her body language. Mrs. Harrison is trying very hard to read from a children's book, and her son Andy is a half-wit. By half-wit, we mean someone who's mentally disabled. Mrs. Harrison reads very painfully. The boy sits on the chair. The girl says, she says says to rhyme with days. Says. Says. The girl says, I. And Susan knows the book off by heart. Look. Mrs. Harrison says, sorry. Notice the number of times Mrs. Harrison apologizes here. Why does she feel the need to apologize to young Susan, younger than herself, when she is learning how to read? Is it something to do with class distinction? Sorry. Look. I look at the boy. The boy eats. Sorry, eats. Eats too much. He will break the chair. And Susan unenthusiastically, very good. Next page. Oh, good. The one with the picture of the beautiful girl. And she says to Andy, who is squirming with boredom, be still. Lillian comes out of the house and onto the veranda. Good evening, Mrs. Harrison. And Mrs. Harrison stands. Again, we see something about the class distinction there. Good evening, Mrs. Dawson. Sit down, Mrs. Harrison. Good evening, Andy. Andy appears not to have heard. Mrs. Harrison grabs her son's hand to gain his attention. Say hello to Mrs. Dawson, Andy. Hello, Mrs. Dawson. Susan keeping you busy? We're on to the 3rd story. Soon there will be no stopping you. I hope so. Lillian looks at Andy, who is scratching his knee with intense concentration. Mrs. Harrison spots her. I'm afraid Andy will never learn how to read. I think he likes the stories. She shrugs. As long as he likes something. I'm sure he does. I told myself, when me husband ran off after he saw how Andy was turning out, I said, no, Andy's not going to end up in a loony bin. Look at the difference in the way Mrs. Harrison speaks. I told meself when me husband ran off. It again shows that she is of a lower socio-economic class than Lillian, and she's not as educated. And when she says Andy's not going to end up in a loony bin, Susan giggles. Lillian and Mrs. Harrison both look at her sternly. He's got to end up living proper in this world. That's why I bring him here, Mrs. Dawson. He'll never learn to read or write, I know that now. But he'll learn good manners, the right things, the proper things. It's not too late, is it? Certainly not. I'm sure he appreciates what you're doing. Learning to read at your age, he knows your sacrifices. Would you like a cup of tea? I'm about to have one. Susan? Susan nods. I'll bring them out, and a glass of lemonade for Andy. She returns inside. All right, let's go on. No, no, no. Andy! And he squirms on the bench. Mummy! What do you want? The tiger and the butter. Oh no, Andy, you must be bored by that. It's a story that obviously Susan has told Andy many times before, and Mrs. Harrison has told him many times before. Tell it quickly, Susan, then he'll calm down. He loves the way you tell it. If I tell the story, will you be a good boy? Yes. So Susan recites the story from memory. Now think about what ideas or issues this story foregrounds or foreshadows. One day, while out walking, little black Sambo saw 3 tigers creeping after him. He was so scared that he began to run, and the 3 ferocious tigers chased after him, snarling and growling. He ran fast as he could to the nearest tree and climbed up it. The tigers couldn't climb up after him, so they started to chew the tree. To stop them, little black Sambo took off his clothes and threw them down to the tigers, who loved them so much that they fought for them. One of the tigers grabbed all the clothes, and the others chased him around the tree faster and faster, while little black Sambo yelled for help, crying out, "The tigers are going to eat me up!" Remember this story for later. George enters wheeling his bicycle, and Andy still repeating loudly, "The tigers are coming to chew me up! The tigers are coming to chew me up!" Evening, Mrs. Dawson. Evening, Mr. Dawson. Hello, Mrs. Harrison. Andy. Susan's telling him a story. Not the tigers and the butter again. Andy suddenly spots something off stage and points to it. Look, look, in the tree. George laughs. There's nothing there, Andy. Andy suddenly jumps up and runs off stage. Andy! And they watch him clamber up the tree, but this is all happening off stage. Up the tree again. What a boy! It's the only pepper tree in the district. I think he likes it. Honestly, sometimes I don't know what I'm going to do with him, Mr. Dawson. He'll be all right. I don't know. You've always been very kind to him, but not everyone is like you. People can be cruel to people like Andy. A few weeks ago, I took him to Animogi to me sisters, and he disappeared, just like that. Quick as a flash. I searched for him all afternoon and found him huddled outside the slaughter yard, covered in blood. I said, "What's the matter, Andy?" He didn't make sense, babbled. You know, later on I found out he had wandered into the slaughter yard. The men thought he was funny. You know Andy, Mr. Dawson. Do anything. So they shoved him inside a bullock carcass. For a lark. A lark. He was hollering to be let out, but they held him there. Thought it was a great joke. He has nightmares about it. Wouldn't you? Here we can see how cruel people are to anyone who is different. And this is a point that Louis Nowra makes in this play a number of times, that people who are different are mistreated and bullied. And this is a criticism of Australians about the way we treat people. Anyone who's different. Andy is mentally impaired, and because of that he's bullied and pushed inside a bullock carcass. And he's closed up in there and not allowed to be let out. Of course he will have nightmares. Remember how one of the values that Australians pride themselves on is mateship and including people and giving people a fair go. Do you think this is giving people a fair go, being inclusive and being mates? Andy yells and laughs. Oh, yeah! Mrs. Harrison calls, "Come down, Andy." "Oh, I am sorry, Mr. Dawson." So look at how Mrs. Harrison's monologue positions us to consider how Australians treat the other. Lillian comes out with the tea. What's happening? Andy's up the tree again. "Andy, come down and have a glass of lemonade." "No, no, no." "Don't worry, he'll come down when he sees us having our tea." They prepare to sit down for tea. Mrs. Harrison is watching Andy. Andy, stop that! And the others look back at the tree. Andy, I want you to stop that. Lillian suddenly stands up and says, Susan, go inside. She's protecting Susan, but from what? What's the matter? Put them back on. Andy, put them back on. And Andy's trousers are flung down at their feet. So obviously, Andy is taking off his clothes when he's up that tree. And Susan has to be sent away to be protected because we cannot have her looking at male body parts. Remember when this is set. And also remember the story, The Tigers and the Butter, how the protagonist in that story ran up the tree to escape the tigers chasing him, and how he took off his clothes and threw them down. So Andy is reenacting that story, but it will still be important later. Andy, naughty boy! George laughs. Susan is fascinated. Lillian is annoyed. Andy screams triumphantly, yeah! Blackout. So we have another scene here where we see more characters who will become more important later. We see the noblesse oblige of Lillian and Susan even though she doesn't want to be there. And we learn something about the nature of Australian mateship. And as this play continues, we will learn a lot more about that.